Good evening. I'm Ned Cabanis, the current president of the World Affairs Council of Western North Carolina, and I'm delighted to welcome this large crowd here to the Owen Conference Center, UNC Asheville, for our first presentation of our fall lecture series. There'll be 3 more presentations this fall, one in October, one in November, one in December. For the details on who will be the speaker, the topic, and the date, please visit our website, which is www.maine.nc.us/WAC for World Affairs Council. You've all memorized that now, right? Most of you here actually should have received a flyer, or you can pick one up out at the table. This is primarily for the people who are going to be watching our television program. We're being televised tonight. We're delighted that we're going to have the opportunity to have this program shown on the Asheville Educational Channel. So if you want to repeat it later on, that's an option. Just for your information, the Great Decisions program will start on the 2nd of February in 2004. That includes 6 lectures, 1 on each succeeding Monday, and then there will be 2 final World Affairs Council program lectures, 1 each in April and May. Now, come to why you're all here this evening, and I'd like to introduce our speaker. Bill Spellman is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Programs in Humanities at UNC Asheville. He received his PhD in History from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University in 1986 and joined the History Department at UNC Asheville in 1988. And he's directed the Humanities program at UNCA from 2002. He's author of a number of books, among which are John Locke and the Problem of Depravity, The Latitudinarians and the Church of England, European Political Thought, The Global Community, Migration and the Making of the Modern World. And in October of this year, his next book is going to be published. That's called The West, Culture and Ideas. Now tonight, Bill's going to be painting on a pretty large canvas. He's going to review 500 years of global history for us and speculate a bit about the roots of our current global political environment. Now, I've heard this presentation before, and I can assure you, you're in for a pretty exciting evening. So with that, Bill, please. How about
Thank you, Ned. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Grace? It's fine. Before I begin, 2 disclaimers and 1 confession. The first disclaimer, nothing you will hear over the next 45 minutes is original. It's completely unoriginal. And if you'd like to go to an original source or someone who put forward some of the ideas, the arguments I'm going to make this evening, I think a good place to start is with the Penguin History of the World by J.M. Roberts. It was first published in the mid-1980s. It's been updated a number of times in new editions. And the very fact that it is a history book, is in paperback and published by Penguin and read by people, speaks well for it. And it's a very, very powerful interpretive and controversial history of the world, and available at most bookstores in the Penguin section. The second disclaimer is that what you're going to hear this evening are a series of generalizations, and all of you know that the best generalizations are misleading and the worst generalizations are just plain wrong. And hopefully this talk will be somewhere in the middle if I do it right. The confession I have to make has to do with my own interests right at this moment in my life. Ned mentioned that I have a book coming out with a colleague from the Penn State system called The West, Culture and Ideas. I never thought I'd end up writing a Western Civ textbook. It goes against everything that's in my bones and has been in my bones for the past 15 years. When I started here at UNCA in 1988, I had taught at a couple of different institutions Western civilization. And I felt fairly confident teaching a course in Western civilization. I arrived here at UNC Asheville, and during the interview, the chairman of the department said, well, Spellman, we don't teach Western Civ here. We teach world civilizations. We teach comparative world civilizations. Can you do that? And this was after a number of years searching for a job and being turned down a number. I said, yes, I can do world civilizations. There's not a problem. Well, I felt that I was being disingenuous in a sense. I felt good about Western Civ. I could teach my field of training, Tudor Stuart England, 17th century England. They asked if I could do medieval Europe. That's a stretch, but I said yes. They asked a number of other things. I said yes, yes, yes. I can do small engine repair. I want this job. But the World Civ course really gave me pause. Every morning, I taught it at 8 a.m. and again at 11, my first semester. And mornings I would come in and I was literally a night ahead of the students in that class because I had been trained in a traditional Western Civ model, the history of ideas, and I was being asked to learn about and then communicate and engage ideas, civilizations, issues, controversies that were new to me. And I had this great fear every morning coming into class, especially that 8 o'clock class, that this would be the morning when one student would raise her hand and she'd say, "You don't know any more than we do. You've just learned this last night." Thankfully, it never happened. Students here are very polite. They're very kind. But I will say on Christmas, at the end of that first semester, I was visiting my wife's family in Buffalo, New York, and I woke up with terrible pains in my chest. And I was only 29 years old, and they'd rushed me down to the hospital, and they gave me a lot of tests throughout the day. And finally, the physician said to me, "Oh, we can't find anything wrong with you." I thought I was having a heart attack. He said, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "Well, I teach." He said, "Well, what do you teach?" And I told him this story about Western Civ, going to World Civ. Stress. He said, "Stress. You need to relax and get away from that course for a while." I haven't gotten away from that course. I love teaching world civilization. Although I'm a generalist, I approach it as a non-specialist. I think it really is important for young people, old people like me, to have a sense, even if it's a modest sense, of the rest of the global community and how it interacts or doesn't interact with the West. And so I was asked 2 years ago to help out this colleague at Penn State writing a Western Civ text. And I told the publisher, it's Prentice Hall, I said, why do you do Western Civ? No one reads Western Civ anymore. They don't teach it. And much to my chagrin, really, I learned that it is still a course that's taught in a number of colleges, a number of community colleges in particular. So in a way, I've been living in a dishonest intellectual life the last 2 years, writing this textbook on Western Civ, all the while knowing that I'll never use that textbook in my own classes. I'll never employ that textbook, nor would I want to. And I hope some of what I say tonight brings home the importance of moving beyond a sort of Western perspective of the global community. So we'll start in the year 1500 and get down to 2003 and we'll finish by the time Tampa Bay beats Philadelphia. How's that? We can do this 500-year survey. If you were looking, and I apologize for the poor quality of this overhead, I'll just describe it to you. I think arguably one could say that in the year 1500, there were 5 powerful civilizations on the face of the earth. 3 of them were Muslim civilizations. And we'll look at 2 of the 3 this evening. The Ottoman Empire, which in terms of its geographic sweep rivaled the size of the Roman Empire at its height. Safavid Persia, a majority Shiite empire, a rival of the Sunni empire, the Ottoman Turks, a lot of conflict between Safavid Persia and Ottoman Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. But nonetheless, 2 Islamic, very powerful empires in terms of political organization, in terms of economic might, wherewithal, and in terms of military sophistication. The 3rd great Muslim empire we'll visit briefly is Mughal India. Again, in terms of those benchmarks, economic sophistication, political integrity or unity, and military prowess. Very sophisticated, very advanced civilizations. Those of you who have read the work recently of a very controversial scholar, retired now from Princeton, Bernard Lewis. He's written a number of works post 9/11 with titles like What Went Wrong. Some would argue that one of the reasons for the resentment or a troubled perspective on the part of some Muslims towards the West is a lack of understanding, empathy, and knowledge of the height, the power, the sophistication, the culture of Islamic civilization for so many centuries. And most importantly, I think, Ming China, in terms of the most sophisticated civilization on the face of the earth. If you were a betting person, I think in the year 1500, and you were in a hypothetical space shuttle and you had to land, you wouldn't land the thing in the last civilization on this map, Western Europe. You don't want to go there because it's the least developed, it's the least sophisticated, it's the most quarrelsome civilization in 1500. And if we walk down to the year 1550, or take the year 1500 for argument's sake, and you were to ask a European woman or man, what's on their mind? What is the real fear? What is really driving that civilization? It would be the year 1453. Fear of, in its aftermath, the year 1453. Because in the year 1453, the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, finally fell. Unless you want to take the argument down to Tsarist Russia in 1917, but we won't go there. The Roman Empire collapsed in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks finally devastated, broke through the walls of Constantinople, took over the capital city, renamed it Istanbul. And for Europeans, the fear was palpable because by 1525, Suleiman the Magnificent and the forces of the Ottoman Empire are at the gates of Vienna. They've taken Budapest. They're at the gates of Vienna, and they'll be back there in 1687. I think the fear that Europeans had in the early 16th century was every bit as deep, as every bit as powerful as in the 8th century. When Muslim forces, the early 8th century, came across the Straits of Gibraltar, into Spain, across the Pyrenees and into France, a sort of pincer movement as the Byzantine Empire is struggling with Islam to the east. A real fear in the 8th century that perhaps Christendom has seen its day. Perhaps Islam, the new dynamic civilization of the 7th and 8th century, is going to win the day in Western Europe. That fear of the 8th century, I think, returns in a really meaningful, palpable sense in the 16th century. Western Europe is the backwater of these 5 major civilizations in the global community. And the question that's been posed and answered by people more competent than myself, why? Why did this happen? Because we know that over the last 500 years, all of that has changed and changed dramatically. There are a number of great revolutions in the human experience, but for my money, 2 of them stand out. The first occurred round about 10,000 to 7,000 BCE, when women and men stopped running after their dinner. It's the agricultural revolution. When sedentary civilizations emerged, when people could settle down, they could defend a territory, mine and thine, city life, bureaucracy, government, all of these things emerged at the advent of the agricultural revolution, 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. I believe that the second most significant revolution in the human experience happened very quickly. It happened over 500 years, from 1500 to 1945. And in the sweep of the human experience, that is very quickly. That is a flash of time. We think of looking back to 1500, that's a very long time ago. It is not in terms of the sweep of human history. And that revolution is what we might encapsulate under the heading, the word modernization. For good or ill, modernization. And it's a modernization that's driven, that's mandated in a way by the West. A West that in 1500, a betting person would not, if they were sensible, put their money on in terms of which of the great civilizations in the year 1500 is going to come to dominate the globe. A betting person, if she or he were sensible, would put their money on Ming China. I'd put my money on Ming China in 1500. The least likely civilization. Religiously divided by 1520, politically divided since the fall of Rome in the West in 476, economically divided into nation-states, quarrelsome nation-states with tariff boundaries and resistance to trade, linguistically divided, culturally divided. Europeans don't get along. And if you compare those civilizations with these 3 Islamic civilizations, with Ming China, Europe looks very troubled in the year 1500. How do we explain the ascent and the dominion, the hegemony, for a brief moment anyway, of the West in the global community over the last 500 years, which I would argue is a very brief span of time indeed? Let's go to the slide, Margaret. I think the world today is, we talk a lot today about diversity and multiculturalism, all to the good in my judgment. These are good things. But I think the world today is less diverse and less multicultural than it has been at any time in the human experience. I think that there's been a homogenization of political and cultural and economic life that has taken place over the last 500 years, and in the only compartment of life where that homogenization hasn't taken place is in religion, in my judgment. Varieties of vibrant religious experiences are still very much with us at the start of the 21st century. But I think that in 1500, there were truly autonomous, singular, comparatively speaking, civilizations which developed in relative, comparative autonomy throughout the human experience until 1500. And since 1500, that autonomy, that richness, that diversity has been eroded and in some cases has been erased. And it's been eroded and erased by a dynamic and powerful and sometimes troubled West. And it's done that on 3 counts. If you look around the global community today, again, generalizations here, at best misleading, at worst, you know. If you look at the political community, the political life of the global community, again and again and again, and if you watched the president's address last night, this sort of notion of a Pax Americana, of some universal values, universal political ideals that are applicable everywhere. You know, it's very questionable, but there it is, it's laid out. That the advent, the development of democratic societies or movements toward, away from something I spent a number of years looking at, the institution of monarchy. The thing that, when I did this book a couple of years ago, I was very interested in the fact that for centuries upon centuries upon centuries, irrespective of the civilization, the norm in political organization was monarchy. The idea that one person, one man or one woman is somehow better fitted than everyone else to intuit and implement the divine will. That was the norm in the human experience until 1918. And there are only 26, 27 monarchies in the world today. Why has that changed so dramatically? I think that the political trajectory in the global community is away from this idea of a single-person rule, autocratic government, aristocratic government, monarchical government, and towards a more participatory, democratic government. The examples are all over the globe. We can take India, for example. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister of independent India, addressing the United Nations in 1960. When you think about it, India didn't exist. It existed in the minds of the Congress Party. India as a political entity did not exist for centuries upon centuries. India is a village society. India is a local society. The idea of the nation state, that powerful dynamic, is something that Nehru imbibes in his Western education, in his education in England. And he has this notion of an India which is democratic. And when you think about it, democratic for 50 years, you say, oh, it's an awfully clunky democracy. It seems to be a very troubled democracy at times. But the remarkable thing, a population 4 times the population of the United States of America, they get it done. Over 50 years, not a single military coup in that nation state. It's a remarkable democracy, created out of a variety of peoples, a variety of languages, a variety of cultures that didn't have the experience in self-government that the Americans had from 1619 in Virginia down to 1776, didn't have that sense of a tutorial, if you will, for 150 plus years. Trying to make and Nehru is self-conscious about this state into a modern, industrial democracy. Next. In 1986, when Ferdinand Marcos left and they discovered all those shoes in Imelda's different drawers, when Corazon Aquino became the president in the Philippines, this idea of a people's revolution, of democracy being a universal phenomenon that's applicable irrespective of the cultural and historic traditions of a variety of peoples. The next one, please. Nelson Mandela, this photograph from the early 1960s with Walter Sisulu on the right. Again, Mandela, to me, the person of the 20th century, hands down. I mean, if someone had locked me up for those many years and I came out, I would be angry. I would want revenge. I'd be after you. But to come out and to say, we forgive, we want to rebuild, we want to unify, is to me a set of qualities that just in many respects transcends my comprehension. But again, a democratic South Africa, one person, one vote, irrespective of color, irrespective of race, and irrespective of the past, irrespective of a very horrific past for black South Africans. And in the Middle East, the Israeli Knesset pictured here, this idea that the model of democracy that emerges in the Enlightenment in the West, in the United States, and Western Europe in the 19th century can be applicable to other cultures, other peoples. I mean, it came out, I think, very clearly, again, just to reiterate in the president's words last night, this idea that this model is normative for everybody. Jefferson says in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, to be obvious, that all men are created equal. Well, we mean all people. He meant white property-owning males. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. You can't give them up even if you wanted to. Certain inalienable rights. Among these are the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, and the purpose of government is to protect those things, to advance those things. Jefferson believes that that's a universal rational principle that is applicable globally. And I think today we need to think about these things. What model is applicable globally? Is it insensitive to think that one paradigm, one model that has succeeded in the West to a certain extent is applicable globally? So the political model, you could find examples of the spread of a Western political paradigm over the last 500 years, particularly the last 200 years. On the economic front, you could say, well, here we are in downtown Detroit. But we're not. We're in downtown Cairo. The idea of the large city, the urban center, the hustle-bustle of an economic order which at least aspires to a set of material values and a quality of life which is very much where the precedent has been set in the West. Or down in Charleston, South Carolina, as the container ships are unloaded. But it's not, of course. It's in Shanghai, China. This idea, a very interesting idea of trying to maintain a government model, ostensibly a communist government model, but increasingly a free market economy. Whether the two, in fact, will jive at the start of the 21st century is a question mark. And the next one. Or back to India again in 1964, the first civilian nuclear power station built with American help just outside of Mumbai, Bombay. This idea, again, Nehru's vision of a modern India, antithetical in a way to Gandhi's vision of a small, village-based, rural India. I always think of, perhaps incorrectly, the chasm between those two close friends, Nehru and Gandhi, as similar to the chasm between Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson, the America of small farms, individual small family farms. Hamilton wanting to, well, if we're going to match the British, if we're going to have our independence, we need to build industry, build commerce and trade. The modern India of the 20th century, where we say, well, India is a poor country, India is a backwards country, but if you look at over 1 billion people and 200 million of those people living by Western standards in the middle class, automobiles, air conditioning, access to higher education, it is a Western economy in so many respects. Next one. And finally, in Bangkok, Thailand, or perhaps on I-26 coming up in the morning, there's a really nice 65 Mustang here in Bangkok, Thailand. But this model of an economic paradigm which, again, is spreading across the globe at the end of the 20th, start of the 21st century, is for good or ill, this is a value judgment, for good or ill is a Western-inspired model. Okay. We can go on. But it wasn't the case in 1500. Let's look at the Ottoman Empire in the year 1500. I said that most Europeans were fearful in 1500 that the Ottoman Turks, Islam was ascendant again, was attacking the Balkans, was reaching up to the gates of Vienna. This is the Ottoman Empire encompassing the Mediterranean basin. And it represents, for Western Europe, a real challenge. Those of you who studied Western civilization know that during the Wars of the Reformation, Suleiman the Magnificent, the ruler between 1522 and 1560, was actually doing deals with Francis I of France. So here's Christians in alliance with Muslims because the Christian in the middle, Charles V, the Emperor Charles V, was the enemy of Francis I. It's a very complicated picture. And Europeans see Islam as something that needs to be addressed, only Europeans can't get their political act together to do it effectively. The next slide, Margaret. This is Suleiman the Magnificent represented here. Again, he's a contemporary. We think in terms, I think, traditionally of Western Europe. Margaret, if you can go to the next slide. Suleiman is a contemporary of Henry VIII of England. Henry reigns from 1509, dies in 1545. Suleiman, again, 1520 to 1562, or 1522 to 1560, round about the same time. And we think, I know in my own training it was, this is Henrican England, this is the period of the Reformation, this is anticipating the great Elizabethan age. Henry VIII might as well be in Greenland as far as Suleiman the Magnificent is concerned, in terms of power, in terms of sophistication, just in terms of demographics. There are 2.5 million people in Henry VIII's England in the 1520s. There are 14 million people in Suleiman's Ottoman Empire. I mean, just in terms of demographic, in terms of military sophistication, in terms of economic power, in terms of the cultural life of that vibrant civilization, England is a backwater, the far northwestern reaches of the Afro-Eurasian intercommunicating zone. That's England. Where is it? No one in Constantinople really cares. The next slide. That empire stretches across North Africa. This is a photograph from Algeria. Next one, Margaret. And it's always there, the Ottoman Empire, always there, as I said, right down until 1687, some would argue right into the 18th century, as a perennial threat, a perennial challenge to a politically fragmented, religiously divided, and linguistically and ethnically troubled Western Europe. If we move, I'm going to skip over Safavid Persia. If we move to Mughal India, this is the second of the great Mughal emperors, Muslim emperors of India. His name was Akbar. He's a contemporary of Elizabeth I. He reigns from 1542 and he dies in 1605. Elizabeth reigns 1558. She dies in 1603. If you could just go to the next slide just to get that sense. We always think of the great Elizabethan age. This is the height of the Renaissance in Western Europe. This is the period of European sophistication, despite the religious wars that were endemic at the time. But again, I think that from a Muslim perspective in India, England and Western Europe are backwaters. Margaret, if you could go back to the slide of Akbar. In the background here is the Red Fort in Delhi. I have another slide of that. So let's go forward two more. One more, please. The empire that Akbar and his descendants created in this sort of pinkish orange area is the region controlled by Akbar. It includes present-day Pakistan and Bangladesh, North India, the Deccan Peninsula in the center, and his successor, Shah Jahan, will push the envelope of Mughal power down into southern India. So in terms of geographical sweep, and certainly in terms of population, this empire, which is governed by a tiny minority of Muslims. I mean, it's obviously a majority Hindu population. When the Muslims first came into India in the 11th century, much of the Buddhist monasteries, Buddhist culture, Buddhist life in North India was destroyed. But Hinduism remained vibrant, remained strong. And Akbar has a decision to make. As a Muslim ruler, what is the mandate that he feels is essential to governing what could be a very hostile population? We go to the next slide. And the solution is a unique one. I think it's a unique one for the 16th century, but more so it's a unique one for Western Europe in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. Because what Akbar does as a Muslim ruler in India is to embrace the majority population, the Hindu population. He reduces and then eliminates the special taxes that Muslims had assessed on non-Muslims. He welcomes Hindus into his government. He marries a number of Rajput princes in North India. And he also brings in members of the Sikh community in India, a new late 15th century religious denomination which tries to synthesize, in a way, Sikhism, tries to synthesize Islam and Hinduism. So there's a great sense of tolerance and mutual respect for a brief moment in 16th century India under Akbar. I belabor this point because if we turn to Western Europe at the same point of Akbar's reign, we have the wars of religion after the Protestant Reformation. Western Europe is in a very bad state in the 16th, right down to the middle of the 17th century, Christian against Christian. And here's an example in South Asia in the 16th century of a minority government, a minority ruler, reaching out to the majority population to create what, by any standard, is a remarkably efficient and powerful empire. This photograph here is from just outside of Agra. It's a palace called Fatehpur Sikri. Akbar had it built and only actually lived there for 10 years, although the architecture is absolutely fabulous. It's red sandstone, and you could actually, it's so soft you could scratch it and take, don't do that. They only lived there for 10 years because they never got any water up there. But if you look at, I mean, architecture speaks to us. It tells us a lot. It tells us about political organization, it tells us about culture, it tells us about the power of the elite. And the building that the Mughals undertook in the 16th and 17th century, by global standards, bespoke a government that was advanced, sophisticated, and certainly dwarfed the aspirations of the Westerners. If we go to the next slide. I love this slide. It's Akbar's successor, the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, and it's allegorical here. He's handing a copy of the Quran to the Ottoman Caliph, the leader of the Ottoman Empire. And the symbolism is important here. From the Mughal point of view, the real leadership in the Islamic community rests in Agra, in Delhi. And the subordinate is the Ottoman ruler. But this was done in the second decade of the 17th century, just after the English had arrived in England, in India. The English, of course, arrived in the colonies of the Americas in 1607. 3 years later, in 1610, Sir Thomas Roe, other English traders arrive at Surat and later at Bombay. And this portrait here of Shah Jahan wants to make a statement, I think, about global power. So the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman ruler, and down here in the corner, a little guy, is James I of England. Okay? He's little. He's insignificant. This is the sense of Eurocentrism doesn't work here. Okay, this is a civilization that is extremely proud, extremely self-confident, and sees the English traders, sees the Portuguese traders, sees the French traders as very much supplicants, as very much having very little to trade with India. India's spices, India's silk, India's riches. The Europeans say, well, we've got some lumber, we've got some fish, what can we trade with you? The Indians don't want any part of this. They see Western Europe as very much the petitioners in this trade that develops in the late 15th, 16th, and 17th century. Next slide. Everybody recognizes this from the Tourist Bureau. This is the burial place of Shah Jahan's wife, Mumtaz Mahal, the Taj Mahal, built in the 1620s and 1630s. Again, when you enter this courtyard and you look at the Taj Mahal and you walk around, it just bespeaks power, it bespeaks organization, it bespeaks security for a brief moment, for a couple of centuries in India under the Mughals. And it's also indicative of an empire that's very unusual for its time in its ability to be inclusive, to embrace, in this case, a majority population. Now, that said, rather than mislead you too much, the successor to Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, was retrograde. He began persecuting and excluding Hindus, and things went very bad in the late 17th and early 18th century. But for a moment, it was a shining example of power, economic might, and military sophistication. Next slide. This is the Red Fort in Delhi, again from the 17th century. It's interesting to me that Independence Day in India, the centerpiece of Independence Day is a rally and a march and a speech by the Prime Minister from the Red Fort in Delhi. And it's a building that was constructed under a minority government, under a Muslim government. But I think it also, in a way, it's a good thing. It bespeaks the type of inclusiveness that Nehru, when that nation was founded, in 1947, wanted to embrace this idea of an architecture which might be particular to a particular one religious faith, but includes all Indians in its mandate. Okay, next one, Margaret. This is the holy city of Amritsar in the north, in the Punjab, the Sikh community. Again, just another example of bringing other elements of the religious population into the governance structure of India. Okay, let's go to Ming China. From 1368 to the 1640s, the most advanced civilization on the face of the earth. And many of us know this. When you think of, in terms of China, dynasties come and go, figures come and go, but the Confucian structure, the culture, the values remain dynasty after dynasty, ruling family after ruling family. And on so many benchmarks, as a number of scholars, Paul Kennedy at Yale among them, have indicated, the West, when it arrives in China, is very much interested in learning from China, in terms of just from ancient China, gunpowder, paper production, printing presses. In the 11th century, more iron was produced in China than at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 18th century Britain. Just on so many benchmarks, we can take, for example, under the Han Dynasty, the beginning of the Grand Canal, almost 1,000 miles in length, linking the administrative center of Beijing with the agricultural breadbasket of the Yangtze River. I mean, this is in, what, the 3rd, 4th century. And what do we get excited about in the 1830s? The Erie Canal, 320 miles from Albany to Buffalo. Please, this is centuries before, 1,000 miles of engineering sophistication. Next slide. And the Great Wall, which is more symbol than substance. Symbol in the terms of the ability of the government to marshal manpower, human resources, economic resources, to send a message to the barbarians in the north that the government of China is strong and vibrant and will keep them out. I sometimes think of the Great Wall of China as akin to that. This is actually a very sad memory of in 1983 when American Marines were killed in Beirut. If you remember, just after that, President Reagan sent a number of the refitted World War II battleships there. There was this scene of the big guns on those battleships firing. I'll use Joseph Conrad in Heart of Darkness, used the description, firing into a continent. Just the symbolism, in a way, the battleship had become anachronistic by the 1980s with air power and Exocet missiles and other things. But there it was, the symbol of power. So too with the Great Wall of China. It's a testimony and reflects the ability of this government, century upon century, to organize human and material resources in a manner that dwarfs anything that's going on in the West until really the 17th and 18th centuries. Next slide. And of course, under the Ming in the 15th century, the building of that symbol of power and unity, of the idea of the emperor as the son of heaven, and the middle kingdom is somehow metaphorically between heaven and earth. In the Forbidden City, the architecture speaks to us again of order, power, sophistication, economic wherewithal. The next slide. And it's the Europeans who want the goods of China, the fine porcelains. I apologize on this slide. If we can go to the next one, actually, it's a better image. The Chinese in the 15th and 16th century are even producing for a specialized market. And you can see it here with the Arabic calligraphy on this bowl. This is really a high level of production for a consumer market halfway around the world, very much on the terms of the Chinese. Historians have argued or guesstimated that a great deal of the gold extracted from the Aztec Empire by the Spanish in the early 16th century and the silver extracted from Peru ends up in China as the currency that the Europeans need. The Chinese have no need for anything that the West has. Again, it's the sort of same relationship that India is in with the West. But certainly the Westerners, these affluent Westerners, are very keen, very much interested in bringing home the sophisticated, advanced products, the material culture of China during this period. And next slide, I think the final sort of clincher. A Muslim eunuch in China, a man named Zheng Ho, who leads between 1405 and 1433 7 overseas long-range voyages of exploration to South Asia, to India, to Sri Lanka, to the Persian Gulf, to East Africa. Now, these are overseas expeditions sponsored by the government, by the Ming government, that go on for upwards of 30 years, long before Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492. Okay, this is 1405 to 1433. The technology, the sophistication, we're talking about hundreds of ships and thousands of men. And to give you some sense of the scale of this, here's the Nina or the Pinta or the Santa Maria, I don't know which one it is, against a Chinese junk in the background from the early, if you could juxtapose those two. And again, I think it signifies the ability of a government to marshal its resources and through a command economy structure, I'll say a bit more about a command economy in a moment, to be able to go out to the rest of the world and explore as the Europeans did at the end of the 15th century. And all of it comes to a close in the early 1430s. The Chinese government determines, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was more trouble on the northern borders from the barbarians in the north, but closes down all overseas exploration. And the most compelling reason for this is that those 7 overseas voyages of exploration brought back to China some of the goods, some of the riches, some of the products of the non-Chinese world. And there was very little there was very little that China was interested in. A couple of giraffes from East Africa, okay, that might entertain the emperor for a while, but there's really nothing out there. The Chinese were right. We look at this, it's not a nice word, we would call it ethnocentric, but the Chinese considered the rest of the world outside as somehow the barbarian world. And they were right at this time in the 15th century in terms of economics, in terms of political unity, in terms of military power. The rest of the world community paled before China's power, presence in the global community. So it ends. China is self-sufficient. China is content. China can provide for its own. Okay. Well, here he is, just out of the Asheville Cleaners. He's very smart looking here. As Christopher Columbus has arrived. It's the start, it's the end of the 15th, it's the beginning of the 16th century. Europe is interested, at least the Spanish, the Portuguese, and later in the 17th century, the French and the English, in reaching the East, in circumventing, in getting around that troublesome middleman who is pushing up the prices on all the goodies coming across the Silk Road, the Ottoman Turks. Not only are they besieging Vienna, but they're pushing up prices on the goods that we want. So there has to be a way, there has to be a mechanism for the West to access the goods of the East, and this guy thinks he's landed there. And in 4 voyages, he never gets the picture that he's really bumped into 2 additional continents. But it's, I mean, the idea of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492 taking a really big gamble in financing this comparatively small expedition compared to Chinese earlier expeditions, going in a westerly direction to find China is unprecedented and also a great gamble. It pays off, of course, for Spain in the 16th century as the successors to Columbus. Next one, please. Oops, this is Hernan Cortez. We've cut off his head, but doesn't he have good-looking legs? Cortez in 1516. Pizarro, the next one, I think we have Pizarro's head. Yes, there it is. In the 1530s in the Incan Empire, destroying those 2 sophisticated Amerindian empires. Spain lucks out because the gold and silver does come back and make Spain, for a moment in the 16th century, the most powerful empire in Western Europe. Strongly Catholic, strongly counter-Reformation, interested in using those resources and beating up on the English, among other people, in the Armada of 1588. But it's that experience of the Spanish that the French and the English hope to replicate in the 17th century. When they arrive at Jamestown, I don't know how many of you have visited Jamestown, the malarial swamp which is Jamestown. I mean, that first voyage out there in 1607, those were employees of a joint stock company, and they were there to replicate the Spanish work of securing the gold and silver for the Virginia Company. Between 1607 and 1624, when the government, the Crown, finally shut the operation down, some 22,000 people had been sent out from England to Virginia, and only about 12,000 of them were still alive in 1624. It was a disaster, an unmitigated disaster. The luck of the Spanish was not going to be replicated in North America. But what did happen? In the West's drive to secure the riches of the East, inadvertently on those Western ships were smallpox, measles, yellow fever, and a guesstimated Amerindian native population in the year 1500 of 50 million, North and South America, North, Central, and South America, which is comparatively the same as Western Europe's population, 50 to 60 million in the year 1500. In 1500, an Amerindian population of about 50 million by 1650 is guesstimated, I use that technical term deliberately, is guesstimated at about 4 million. The disease that destroys the Amerindian population robs the Westerners, robs the Europeans of the resources, the manpower that they need in order to compete with the Spanish. Let me back up here for a second, because we haven't answered the question about Ming China, Mughal India, Safavid Persia, and Ottoman Turkey. Why not one of those civilizations? Why did the West come to dominate the globe? I think there are, at least, I'll suggest 3 reasons, and there are others. First and foremost, all of these governments were, in my judgment, theocratic governments. And by that I meant there was no disjunction between religious authority and political authority. There was a unity of political and religious authority in the Muslim world and, to a certain extent, in China as well. In particular, there was no rival institution to political authority, absolute political authority in those empires. And that's not the case in the West. In the West, from the fall of Rome, from the period of Charlemagne in the 8th century, right down to the Reformation, there's a dynamic tension, a creative tension between church and state, between the aspirations of the successor to St. Peter, who claims authority to be the final authority here on earth and superior to individual temporal leaders, and the aspirant kings and queens of Western Europe who claim an equal, if not superior, authority with the church. And again, throughout the medieval period and the early modern period, there's this dynamic tension between church and state, which limits Western European states and precludes the development of absolutism and a theocratic rule in the West. And I think those who look at the Middle Ages, the medieval period, and describe it as the Dark Ages or 1,000 years without a bath is really wrong on a number of fronts. Just on this one political front, the fact that the church, which inherited really the civil authority from a declining Western Roman Empire and these emerging Western European kingdoms, always in tension, always competitive, actually redounded to the advantage of Western Europe in precluding the development of an absolute theocratic rule. The second point I would raise is I think these non-Western civilizations were by and large command economies in which the state could dictate whether or not a merchant class could do A rather than B, production schedules, production limits. China is the good example. In the early 15th century, at the end of these overseas voyages, the fact that the government had the power to simply shut it down was combined with a tradition in Confucian culture which in a way disparaged entrepreneurial spirit. Okay? That person who was elevated, who was held up in traditional Confucian culture, was the bureaucrat scholar. Okay? So, and similarly in the Ottoman world, there was a sense of the government having complete control over that middleman function with the West. And the third factor I just throw out to you, we can talk about this later, is how to describe this. Success. And this is the part of this talk that troubles me a lot because it's actually, for us, at the start of the 21st century, a dispiriting message. China was an enormously successful civilization. Ottoman Turkey was a successful civilization. Mughal India was successful. And success led, particularly in the Chinese case, to complacency. A failure to innovate, a failure to take chances, a failure to take risks. Western Europeans did all of those things because Western Europeans were competitive. They didn't like each other after the Protestant Reformation. The English hate the French hate the Dutch hate the Italians, and everybody hates the Germans. It's a very fractious continent in the early 16th century. And the heads of those European states are willing to gamble. They're willing to roll the dice. They're willing to take a risk on crazy Italians like Columbus, who says that he can reach China by going in a western direction. Oh, sure. I mean, Ferdinand and Isabella is not his first stop. A number of other heads of state sort of, he needs some holiday here. This guy isn't serious. To take a risk, to send someone out, to take a gamble, all in a climate in which European heads of state see their very survival contingent upon developing the resources, the material resources and the military resources to defeat their enemy, their neighbors in Western Europe. Okay? England, Henry VIII versus Francis I in France, Philip II of Spain against Elizabeth I of England. The quarrelsome nature of European society actually inspires heads of state to take risks, to allow the aspirant middle class, the bourgeoisie, the burghers, call them what you will, to take risks and to experiment, to beg, borrow, and steal from these other civilizations. The very fact of Chinese naval technology, stern post rudder, multiple masts, all of this technology is borrowed from the Chinese, and the Europeans use it shamelessly to try and build a competitive civilization. China, on the other hand, sees itself after 1433 as superior, as the center of the universe. So in a way, this is a bad analogy, but you remember the Pinto? The Ford Pinto of the early 70s. I mean, think of Detroit in the early 70s. It was an almost monopoly on the American automobile market. So you build things like the Pinto and the Vega and the Monte Carlo. They're not bad. They're not good cars. And people start voting with their feet. They start buying Toyotas and they start buying Volvos. And with America owning a monopoly on a virtual monopoly on automobile production in the 70s, what's the incentive to innovate, to change, to refine? And it was only the competition that came in the 70s and 80s that started to get the American automobile industry responding, with a lot of help, at least in Chrysler's case, from the United States government. But China has this sense, in a way, the thing that's troubling for me in this explanation is that bad behavior is good. Competitiveness, struggle, a willingness to challenge one's neighbor is actually that which contributes to innovation and change. Okay, next. Well, I'll stop in a moment. I mentioned Europe's aspirations in the 16th century. And once it's recognized, particularly by the French and the English, that they're not going to replicate the success of Spain in the early 16th century in finding the gold and silver and taking it from those sophisticated indigenous Amerindian civilizations, there's a transition. There can be cash crops that can secure wealth for Europe. The importation of sugar from Europe and the cultivation of sugar on the Caribbean, the West Indian sugar islands, the importation of cattle, the importation of horses, all of these European products coming to the Americas, the development of cotton, the cultivation of tobacco, these cash crops that Europeans find, particularly the English in the 17th century, need an intensive labor pool to develop them to get those goods back to Europe for sale. But with smallpox and yellow fever and measles and the absolute devastation of the Amerindian population, you know, the Pizarros and the Cortezes look back and they write back and say, well, it's the superiority of European civilization. It's the superiority of Christianity that has dictated Europe's triumph in the Americas. Put yourself in the place of the Amerindian population, where everyone is dying around you who's not a Christian. And for some reason, the white Europeans who come in with these inadvertent companions on their ships are not dying. What would that do to your belief system if your loved ones, your family, in numbers that are just devastating, 50 million in 1500, 4 million in 1650? It shatters, I think, the indigenous religious cultures and also creates a problem for the Europeans that they will solve. Is it any coincidence to anyone in this room that the beginning of the transatlantic African slave trade, which involved between 12 million and 15 million African women, property. They're not humans. Women, men, and children between 1500 or thereabouts, just as the devastation of the Amerindian population takes place, and the beginning of the 19th century when the nefarious trade ends. Is it any coincidence that the slave trade in West Africa begins with the decimation of the Amerindian population? I would argue the world gets smaller in the 16th century. The connections between Africa and the Americas and Europe are front and center at the beginning of the 16th century, and the horror of African slavery is part of that. Some of you may recognize this. I know that the former President Clinton and his family, and I believe President Bush and his family, in Senegal, going to Gorée, and inside, the next slide, the door of no return, where so many Africans would go out in skiffs onto those large ships. The ships would stay for a while, then move down the coast, deliberately, so that you'd have people enslaved on those ships who could not communicate, not the same language, not the same culture, for the horrific middle passage across the Atlantic. Next slide. And the implements used on the horrific passage and once in the Americas, particularly concentrated in Brazil and in the Caribbean, the next slide, enables the Europeans to supplement, these are human beings, in the cavity of those transatlantic slave ships, chained together, mourning and dying in their own sweat, and the horrors of that experience, not being permitted on deck oftentimes because conditions under the deck were so bad that if individuals were allowed on deck, many of them would just jump overboard and take their own lives. And then finally in the Americas, the next slide, the sale of that property to take the place of the Amerindian population, to produce the cotton, to produce the indigo, to produce the sugar, to produce the crops that go back to Western Europe. And if you trace, in many instances, the wealth that's derived in the Americas and the early factories in industrial England, and the connections between planter wealth and industrial wealth, the connection is direct. And the rhetoric of Europeans in the 18th and 19th century, we're the first industrial civilization, we're the most advanced civilization because we are a superior civilization, because we are better than the rest of the world, is actually built on the backs of a business person's dream, free labor, built on the backs of African labor in the 16th and 17th century. The next slide. And when that trade ends in 1809, or at least is interdicted by the British in 1809, and British men of war hunt down and try to stop the continuation of that trade, then you simply jettison the evidence overboard. In the early 19th century, the West is at its height, it's at its apex. Its values are considered by many to be universal values. But much of that wealth, much of that affluence is built on the labor of a population from another continent that too was disparaged by Western Europe. I would conclude with this thought. It seems to me one historian, world historian, William McNeill, sort of the dean of world history, has argued that what keeps civilizations vibrant, what keeps them vital, what keeps them human is connections, is communication, is empathy, and that which leads to atrophy, that which leads to weakness and decline in civilization, is a sense of either closing oneself off or assuming that the values that you embrace, the ideals that you embrace, the material culture that you embrace, is universally applicable and ought to be exported, at least in the 19th century, by fair means or foul. We know, of course, that the standard of living in the West, the values of the West, the material culture of the West, which the rhetoric of many politicians would suggest is applicable and is something that the rest of the global community wants. If that ideal were realized, if our standard of living were realized, and I'm the richest person in the world, if my standard of living were realized around the world, we would, of course, run out of resources at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. It's an unsustainable paradigm, and it's a paradigm that doesn't involve dialogue about one's own culture with other cultures. McNeill, I think, the danger in all of this, I really respect McNeill, and what gives me pause when I talk about this subject is so many before us have done this sort of thing and have been debunked. I'm thinking of, in the 18th century, Edward Gibbon's great work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a multi-volume synthetic work trying to describe this complex phenomenon, the fall of the Roman Empire. And he described it very easily. The fall of Rome was due to the rise of Christianity. It was due to this otherworldly outlook on the part of an increasing population of Christians. A simplistic, neat, but simplistic vision of the fall of Rome. Or in our own century, or the century just concluded, Oswald Spengler's large synthetic view of the rise and fall of civilization. All of these are generalizations, and ultimately all of them can be challenged, can be disputed, can be rebuked. But I hope if we get anything out of this, it piques some questions. It makes us think about where we are in relation to other civilizations, and most importantly, and I think particularly in a world in which that faith tradition, which is the fastest growing faith tradition, just over 1 billion now, approximately 2 billion Christians, just over 1 billion Muslims, that dynamic growing faith tradition, if there is any truth to the argument that there's a resentment of the West because of the West's ahistorical penchants. In other words, the West and Westerners, our educational system, is not particularly interested in the past. In the Islamic tradition, in non-Western traditions, that there is a rich sense of the past. The past is yesterday. And the past for many Muslim peoples, 3 of these 5 great civilizations, was a rich past, a sophisticated past, and a pedagogical past that taught the West so much in terms of mathematics and science, that when that's forgotten and it's removed from our historical consciousness, we find ourselves diminished, not just in the West, but diminished globally. I'm going to stop there, and we'll take some questions.
Thanks, Bill. That was great. I know that this crowd does not like. It's not on. Okay. Okay. Is that on? Yeah. Good. Thanks. I know this crowd does not like using a microphone, but because we have the television cameras here tonight, and we'd like to be able to hear the questions via television, I'm going to ask those of you who have questions to come up here and ask it in front of the microphone. So with that as introduction, let me ask you to come stand in line and ask your questions.
Or not.
Or not. Go ahead, Barbara.
With some courage, could you look to the future? Because Bernard Lewis does speak about the lack of understanding between the West, our Christian tradition, and the Islamic one. Could you take some of the analogies and see perhaps what is ahead in the next 50 years along the lines you've been giving to us?
I think that one of the products of a liberal arts education at a place like UNCA, this is my own view, I would hope that students who graduate from here take away a sense of humility and ignorance. And I say that seriously. I think the phrase I use most often in class, and I may use it in this instance, is, I don't know. I don't know. Let's find out together. I'm a historian by inclination, and part of it is my reluctance and trepidation at trying to forecast. Just one example, maybe some of you share this. I never thought that I would see the Berlin Wall come down in my lifetime. I just never thought that that would happen. And in that sense, I'm an optimist. I see a very violent global community at the start of the 21st century. I see enormous misunderstanding and ignorance. I think I'm part, personally, of that misunderstanding and ignorance. I know so little, and the more I read and listen to my colleagues and my students, I want to pause and think about the future. I think that there are, again, maybe it's naive optimism. I think there are enough women and men of enormous goodwill who, well, it's the Nelson Mandela, the person of the 20th century for me. I can't imagine how that man did what he did, but he did do it. He forgave, and I'm not sure I'd be up to that, but I'm comforted knowing that there are people who are up to that, and I see those individuals as leaders. I'm not answering your question very well. I'm not very good at a crystal ball. I'm wrong most of the time. I'm told that repeatedly by members of my family, but it's so difficult to forecast. But I do think that without that residual sense of confidence and optimism, then we'd be hard put to get up in the morning. Leah.
Here's one maybe you can answer. I'm Leah Carpin. How can we bring about better understanding between Muslims and Christians, or between Muslims and the rest of the world?
It's interesting this morning, it's an appropriate question. In our second humanities course, which is on the medieval and Renaissance world, we have a week on Islam, and our normal main group lecturer for that week is Afaf Omer, who's away this year on a Fulbright in, I think, the United Arab Emirates. And someone stepped forward from the faculty, Margaret Downs, Peg Downs, who is obviously from outside of that tradition. And at the end of the lecture, we were meeting as a faculty. There are some students here. I don't know what you thought of this, but I said to my colleagues and to Peg, this is not a disparagement of Afaf, but sometimes I think it's useful for a non-specialist and someone outside of a particular tradition, in this case a religious tradition, to try to explicate that tradition, to try to grapple with it and come to some understanding, knowing full well that you'll never master it because you bring your own perspectives and prejudices and misunderstandings. But I think that Peg did a wonderful job as a layperson, if you will, trying to find points of comparison, and there are so many in this family of three great religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that I'll put it this way, Leah. Last year, for reasons that elude me, it was a snow day or a short semester, we didn't do the lecture on Islam in Humanities 214, and the students took us to task. I was delighted that I was sad that we didn't do it. I was delighted that the students took us to task. I think that's optimism for me. That's a sign of good things for the future. There's one recommendation. Sometimes I feel that as a historian, I mentioned the book by J.M. Roberts. People don't read scholarly history works, they're usually written for a very narrow audience. But I'm very much a fan of popular history, history that reaches out and engages. And for my money, the most compelling Western voice on the history of Islam is a woman named Karen Armstrong, who wrote a biography of Muhammad a couple of years ago. She's written a number of important biographies. She's just a fine scholar. In the tradition, some of you may remember of Barbara Tuchman in the 1960s and 70s. Barbara Tuchman never finished her terminal degree or PhD, and I felt was always kind of resented by the historical profession because she didn't have her union card. I think the real reason was that she wrote books that people read, and the people in the union, like me, wrote these narrow academic works. So I think, in a way, it's incumbent upon us in the Western tradition to present, as best we can, the linkages, and there are so many, monotheism not being the least, that make it so, in a way, easy to present Islam as part of a larger conversation. Unhappily, family quarrels are often the most difficult quarrels, but they, I think, can be resolved in the end as well.
Hi, I'm Greg Clemens. I'm at Mars Hill, and I take students to Chiapas every year. And we visit Palenque and Bonampak. And I can't help but wonder that the Mayan contribution to world history is very important. And I'm just curious of your thoughts on that. Their dynasty reached its peak at 900 AD. And it was phenomenal for what it contributed to astronomy and architecture. So your thoughts on the Mayan contribution?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think going back to one of my initial thoughts, prior to 1500, many advanced and sophisticated civilizations, the Amerindian civilizations not least, but were, from the point of view of the rest of the global community, non-existent. I mean, they were autonomous, they were out there. I think one of the real things that is a constant source of embarrassment, actually, for me as a historian, we don't have a Latin Americanist on our faculty. I mean, here is a culture and a rich tradition that certainly is of enormous value at the start of the 21st century and enormous importance to North America, and yet we at this institution don't have the intellectual resources to treat that in a serious way. So your point is well taken. We could, I suppose, make the argument about Great Zimbabwe, or make the argument about Songhai or Mali in Africa.
Bill, you've adroitly described a very voluptuous period in our history. Is there or are there any parallels with globalization and the internet today with the period of time that you've described, as far as impact?
That's a good question. I think I'd respond by, there's a process of intense homogenization that's involved in both phenomena. The Europeanization of the globe that begins after 1500, the physical impress of Europe on the rest of the global community is comparable, or I should say that the internet revolution of the last decade is comparable to the physical impress. The intellectual impress of the internet is comparable to the physical impress of Western Europe's domination of the global community prior to that advance. It's interesting to me with the internet. It's one of the things, book I did last year, I got interested in international migration. So I like writing about things I know nothing about. I see it as a challenge. I mean, my field is Tudor Stuart England, and I was asked, could you write a sort of survey of international migration from 1500? So I said, sure, I don't know anything about that subject. I'll give it a go. If you think about the modern world today, ideas flow freely across international borders, goods flow freely across international borders, services flow freely across international borders, money flows freely across international borders. It's a bit ironic to me that what doesn't flow freely across international borders are human beings. That the world is smaller and more homogenized in terms of the economic world, the business world, the intellectual world, but coming to know your neighbor face to face is a real challenge. It's very recently in the human experience, i.e. 1924 in this country, it's very recently in the human experience that we asked people what they were doing here, globally. I mean, in England in the 19th century, you could disembark and just go on your way. No one asked you any questions. I mean, the movement of peoples was, was greater in a sense in the 19th and early 20th century than it has been in the last 75 years. And in that sense, I think some say that we can learn about other cultures through our next door neighbor, because it is, America in particular, a cosmopolitan, diverse society. But is it? In terms of ideas and in terms of communications, I think there's an argument to be made. The danger, of course, is that communications revolution, it too, in my humble opinion, is Western dominated. That the model, that the child in Mumbai, who may not have a television, but someone in the neighborhood has a television, looks at the images from the West constantly, is bombarded by those images of the West, as to what constitutes a reasonable quality of life. And just the beaming of that out constantly is, I think, does create a sense in which non-Western peoples feel disempowered, that they have access to images of the first world, the Western world, but are precluded the opportunity to realize that quality of life for themselves.
I'm Lottie Meyerson. I was intrigued by your description of the benefits of the tension between state and the church in medieval times, really ending up with you didn't mention, but the really separation of church and state in the United States. What do you see the trend in the world today? Which way is it going?
I think the Western model it's an Enlightenment paradigm. It's privatizing religion, and that's been the model since the 18th century with the Enlightenment, that the affairs of the state ought to be restricted to the temporal sphere, to the here and now. And so this division between church and state, which is permeable, the chasm is certainly a Western model. And we, I think, naively, we in the West, we in the United States, see that as normative, that that's the way things ought to be elsewhere. But I would submit that in most non-Western civilizations, the disjunction, the division between the notion that the state is somehow separate from, divorced from a transcendent agenda and ideals is ludicrous. That there is, and I think this is part and parcel, an important part of Islamic culture, that the state and the values of the state are interconnected with a religious enterprise. And that view of religion as being woven in with what we would call a secular agenda is something that I would say globally is normative, and the Western model is atypical. And I think it's problematic. We see the dangers. I mean, the Enlightenment argument in the West, we recall, the Enlightenment argument in the West was based on history. And the history was not pleasant. It was not nice. It was a history of religious strife, conflict between church and state, church trying to influence the state. And the wars of religion in the 16th century were the nadir of this. And so this reaction against it, that you need to separate out those issues of what Augustine called the city of God from the city of man, that was the only way out of this predicament of religious conflict. That's a Western model that I certainly embrace and applaud, but whether it's appropriate for other religious traditions, other peoples, I'm less sure.
I'm Dick Kranker, and I was impressed with your powerful argument that the tensions within Europe between the church and state is what ultimately resulted in the development of the Western civilization. I see a parallel, or rather I should ask you if you see a parallel between the current homogenization through the European Union of Europe, not willing to take much chances, versus our efforts, the American efforts, to take some chances, moving into Iraq, moving into Afghanistan, which they seem to have been afraid to do.
Well, I suppose one might argue that the European perspective, particularly the German and the French perspective, was looking for a critical mass of evidence that they didn't see there, and a reluctance to employ preemptive option that I think some would argue, I would include myself here, is unique within the American experience. As linked, in my mind, the European perspective, reluctance in the recent events, as part of, and I may be wrong about this, but as part of that willingness to say, I'm not quite sure, I don't know, we need more confirming evidence before we place young people in harm's way. This is not an apology for a reprehensible regime that has been in place in Iraq for many, many decades. But I think that the European posture is more nuanced than that description. That's my view. I think that the debate itself between, say, our current administration and its European friends and partners is a healthy thing. It's a good thing. And just recent developments of the administration going back and looking to the UN, I think is salutary. I think it's good.
Hi, my name is Chuck Breedis. I just wanted to ask you a question, something that's always cropped up with me. To how much of the Western Europe's power would you attribute to this backlog of scientific development, of building up laboriously a base of theories, of principles, and so on, which is then applied and you can produce absolutely technological wonders in the space of a few hundred years, starting with Galileo. And from this basis of power, of this kind of application, I didn't hear you mention anything about the application of science and so on, which completely overwhelmed all these great empires you're talking about. And the second part of my question is, when these people began to see that this technology, what kind of technology is produced from a basis that is experimental in nature, and does all this kind of thing, why didn't they pick up some of these things from us? And what I'm essentially saying is, weren't they able to convert something like the invention of gunpowder into cannon or into howitzers or something along those lines, which was all done in the West? Why stay with acupuncture for all those years and not have a basis of experimental clinical medicine with statistics and so on and so forth, which all came up in the West over here? They didn't pick those things up from us until, I guess, when the Japanese began to imitate the building of battleships in the European model and so on and so forth. They had a completely different concept of science, which could not match what was being produced in Western the United States. Why did they wait so long? That's my question.
First, I would suggest that if we take Islamic civilization, and this is repeating something I said earlier, in terms of medicine, in terms of mathematics, in terms of science, in terms of economics, I think that the Islamic world, right down to the 16th century, was extremely adept and sophisticated. And if you just take, for example, the reintroduction of the works of Aristotle in the 12th century, that was made possible thanks to our Arab neighbors in Andalusia in Spain, translating those texts out of Arabic, Jewish scholars working with Muslim scholars back into Latin, the works of Aristotle, the works of Plato, back into the Western tradition after many, many centuries of their absence. Maybe I can encapsulate this. And it comes back to this idea of theocracy and a command economy. In the Ottoman Empire, I believe it was in the 18th century, the Sultan was able to, in response, there had been a plague, and this fear that a number of astronomical observatories which had been built around Istanbul were somehow responsible, this type of enterprise, this type of activity. And so unilaterally, the Ottoman leader could just have them destroyed. Now that seems extremely short-sighted. How could a sophisticated civilization do this? And I think it has something, not a little, to do with this command and theocratic enterprise. I've telescoped a lot of things here. After Suleiman died, he was followed by 8 to 10 nincompoops, who really, with so much power concentrated in so few hands, one person essentially, could command the resources of a great empire, decisions based on military priorities, on economic priorities, in a way that Western European heads of state couldn't do. I mean, we talk about absolutism in Western Europe. There was no such thing, even under Louis XIV. Louis XIV, the apocryphal phrase that the state, I am the state. A lot of hooey. It's a lot of nonsense. Coming all the way back from the Germanic invasions, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Huns, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, this idea of comitatus, this idea of consultation, the leader consulting with his vassals, I think that that is one of the principal Germanic contributions to Western civilization. The fusion of modern Western civilization of Greco-Roman and Christian and Germanic attributes. The Germanic contribution is this idea that Charlemagne is not omnipotent. Charlemagne is not omniscient. He doesn't know everything. He's not all-powerful. He needs to consult with his comitatus, with his vassals. That develops in the High Middle Ages into the idea of talking things out, parlement, to talk out. In the English tradition, in the French tradition, even in the age of Louis XIV in the 17th century, there are limits to what the absolute monarch out in his Palace of Versailles can do. He always has to consult with the first estate, the church, that dynamic tension again, and he has to consult with the second estate, the nobility. He doesn't care about the third estate, but that'll come back to bite them in 1789. There's this notion that there is a larger community of responsible people, men, who can deliberate issues of the day. Related to that in the West, I think if you go back to this notion of the West being backwards, the West being retrograde, the West seeing itself as disadvantaged vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire, Ming China, Mughal India, how do we achieve the type of wealth and power that these other civilizations have? Let's try, fair means or foul, to try and secure the goods. So you take risks. You allow that bourgeoisie, that burger caste, to innovate, to create something like joint stock companies. The notion of limited liability, of people pooling their money to take risks. That's given the imprimatur of the heads of state. Elizabeth I, when Drake goes and circumnavigates the globe in 1577, he's got the tacit approval of the crown. Go out and give the Spanish fits. Do it, baby. Go. You know, and Drake comes back, and the first question he has, he leaves in 1577. He comes back in 1580, and the first question he has when he lands, do you know what the question is? Because he's been out there giving the Spanish fits. Is the Queen still alive? That's the question he had. Because if the whole administration could have changed. This could have been bad, bad, bad. Because Philip II is saying to Elizabeth I, you've got these pirates out there. Have you allowed them to do this? And the Queen is saying, no, no, of course not at all. All the while she's got her hands behind her back taking her 10% cut. It's a willingness on the part of Western desperados, the heads of state of Western Europe, who are trying to beat up on the French, who don't like the Germans, who really, really loathe the Italians. It's this, and this is what saddens me in a way, it's this that inspires Western heads of state to allow both the members of that talking shop, the parlements, and also the entrepreneurial elements in society to do what they want to do. There's not, the state doesn't have that ability to command. I would describe these non-Western civilizations as they begin to decline as analogous in their command economies to the Soviet Union. Oh, centralize it, state planning, rationalization, top-down management. It leads to, if you don't have the adept and adroit and sophisticated leadership at the top, both in China, which was for centuries upon centuries upon centuries the most advanced scientifically, technologically, economically, hands down, a lot longer than the West. But if you don't have an ability to encourage that, then, and you reach a sort of level of success, then you're asking for trouble. You're asking for trouble. And in a way, there's a lesson at the start of the 21st century, and I think it's William McNeill's lesson. The way to stay vibrant is to listen to your neighbors, to interact with your neighbors, and to allow individuals the opportunity to pursue their own interests within, and this is what we debate, a set of rules which allows other people to live a quality of life that we'd want for ourselves.
Bill, that's superb. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We made it in time for Monday Night Football. I told you we could do this.
Before you leave, let me just remind you that our next presentation is Monday, October 13th at 7:30, and it'll be Mr. John Donaldson, representative of the World Bank, talking about World Bank and development yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you for coming.